The mountains had no name because no creature dared to live close enough to name them, and the peaks rose so high that even the clouds seemed afraid to touch them. And in the heart of those frozen peaks, there was something that did not belong to this world. It fell in from the sky long before the first dragon learned to speak, and long before the first human drew breath on a distant world that none on this planet knew existed. And the thing that fell was massive and strange and made of metals that no forge had ever produced, and its shape was like nothing any creature had ever seen. The dragons found it first because dragons were curious and powerful, and they feared nothing in those ancient days, and they circled the fallen object for many seasons trying to understand what it was and where it came from, and eventually they decided it was a curse sent from the void beyond the stars, and they sealed the mountain pass and forbade any dragon from approaching it. But curses have a way of finding purpose, and the dragon elders were patient and wise. In their cruelty, Vorothony was born in the 47th year of the Crimson Moon Cycle, and her scales were the color of deep ocean water, and her eyes held the light of twin suns, and she was beautiful in the way that all dragons are beautiful, but she carried within her a terrible secret that would not reveal itself until she came of age. Dragons measured worth by legacy, and legacy meant children, and children meant the continuation of bloodlines that stretched back to the beginning of time itself. And when a dragon reached maturity, there was a ceremony where the elders would examine them and declare them fit to carry on the sacred duty of reproduction. Varaki stood before the council of elders on the day of her examination, and she held her head high because she had trained hard and fought well, and she believed she had earned her place among her people. And the chief elder was an ancient creature named Mordrith, whose scales had faded to gray and whose eyes had seen 10,000 seasons pass. Mordrith performed the ritual examination, and his expression changed from formal indifference to something else entirely, and Varathkin watched as the other elders began to whisper among themselves, and she did not understand what was happening until Mordrith spoke the words that would destroy her life. "You are hollow," he said, and his voice carried no emotion because to him she had already ceased to exist as a person and had become merely a problem to be solved. "And you will never bear young, and you will never continue your bloodline, and you are a curse upon our people." Varafkin did not understand at first because she felt strong and healthy, and she could fly higher than any dragon her age, and she could breathe fire hot enough to melt stone. And how could she be broken when everything about her felt so right? But the elders explained in cold and clinical terms that her body would never produce offspring, and that she was sterile, and that this condition was permanent and irreversible, and in the eyes of dragonkind she was now worthless. Her own mother refused to look at her, and her father spoke the ritual words of disownment, and her siblings turned their backs and walked away. And in the span of a single day, Vorathkin went from being a proud young dragon with a bright future to being nothing at all. The punishment for her condition was not death, because death would have been a mercy, and dragons did not believe in mercy for those they considered cursed. Instead, the elders decided to bind her to the fallen object in the Forbidden Mountains, and they would chain her immortal soul to that alien structure until the end of time itself. They dragged her through the mountain passes, and she fought them every step of the way. But she was young, and they were many, and eventually they overwhelmed her and brought her to the place where the strange vessel lay half buried in ice and snow. The ritual of binding was older than memory, and it required the blood of 13 elders and the tears of the one being bound. And Vorathkin wept not because she was afraid, but because she finally understood that her own people hated her for something she could not control and had never chosen. The chains that formed around her were not made of metal, but of something far worse, and they wrapped around her soul and anchored her to the dead ship, and she felt herself become part of its cold and silent structure, and she screamed, but no one listened because no one cared. The elders left her there and sealed the mountain pass with magic and stone, and they returned to their homes, and eventually they forgot about her because forgetting was easier than remembering, and the seasons turned, and the years became decades, and the decades became centuries. Variki explored her prison because there was nothing else to do, and she discovered that the fallen object was actually a vessel of some kind, and it had been built by creatures she could not imagine, and it had traveled across distances so vast that even her immortal mind could barely comprehend them. The vessel was dead, and its crew had perished long ago, and their bodies had turned to dust, and their technology had fallen silent, and Varathkin was alone in a tomb that was not meant for her. She learned to read the strange symbols that covered the walls, and it took her 400 years to understand the basics of the alien language, and she discovered that the vessel had been called something that translated roughly to Eternal Wanderer, and its crew had been explorers searching for new life among the stars. They had found this planet, and they had crashed, and they had died, and their mission had ended in failure, and Varathkin felt a strange kinship with them because they too had been searching for something they would never find. The centuries continued to pass, and Varathkin grew weak because the binding drained. Her strength and her scales lost their luster, and her fire grew dim, and her wings became too frail to carry her, and she spent more and more time simply lying still and waiting for something that she could not name. She prayed to gods she did not believe in, and she begged for death that would not come, and she cursed her people, and she cursed the stars, and she cursed herself for being born wrong. 3,000 years passed, and Varathkin had given up hope entirely, and she had accepted that she would spend eternity in this frozen tomb, and she had made peace with her fate in the way that only the truly broken can make peace with anything. And then one day, the silence was broken by a sound she had never heard before, and it was the sound of engines descending through the atmosphere, and it was the sound of something new arriving in a world that had forgotten how to change. Vorothki opened her eyes for the first time in decades, and she listened, and she wondered if perhaps her prayers had finally been heard. The vessel that descended through the clouds was small and sleek, and it bore markings that Varathkin did not recognize, and it moved with a precision that suggested intelligence and purpose, and she watched from the shadows of her prison as it had landed in the snow-covered valley below the mountains. Creatures emerged from the vessel, and they were unlike anything she had ever seen, and they walked on two legs, and they had soft skin, and no scales, and no wings, and they seemed impossibly fragile. And yet they moved with confidence across the frozen landscape. She could hear them speaking to each other in a language she did not understand, and their voices were high and quick compared to the deep rumbling speech of dragons, and she found herself fascinated by these strange beings who had come from somewhere beyond her world. The leader of the group was a female with dark hair and brown skin, and she carried equipment that blinked with lights and made sounds that seemed to measure and analyze everything around them, and she directed the others with calm authority, and they followed her without question. Warthny later learned that this female was called Dar Elena Vasquez, and she was a xenobiologist, which meant she studied life forms from other worlds, and she had spent her entire career searching for evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe. Elena had detected an energy signature from orbit, and she had convinced her captain to investigate, and the signature had led them here to this frozen mountain range on an uncharted planet, and she had expected to find minerals or ancient ruins, or perhaps the remains of a crashed satellite. She had not expected to find a dragon. The moment Elena stepped into the outer corridors of the alien vessel, she knew something was different, and the air felt heavy with age and sorrow, and there was a presence in this place that made her skin prickle with awareness. She followed the energy readings deeper into the ship, and her crew followed behind her, and they were nervous, but they trusted her judgment, and she had never led them astray before. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, and in the center of that chamber, wrapped around what appeared to be a reactor core, was the largest creature Elena had ever seen. Vorothkin raised her head, and looked at the humans, and she expected them to scream and run, and she was already preparing herself for the disappointment of being alone again. But they did not run. Elena stood very still, and she studied the dragon with the same careful attention she would give to any new discovery, and she noted the dull scales and the dim eyes and the way the creature seemed to be bound to the ship itself by chains that were not quite visible to the naked eye. "You are trapped here," Elena said, and her voice was calm and clear, and Vorathkin was surprised to realize that she could understand the words, even though she had never heard this language before. The binding translated all speech into something she could comprehend, because the ritual had been designed to ensure she would understand every creature that might one day mock her imprisonment. "Yes," the dragon replied, and her voice was rough from centuries of disuse, and the humans startled at the sound, but they did not flee, and Elena simply nodded as if speaking to ancient dragons was something she did every day. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and I am a scientist, and these are my colleagues, and we come from a world called Earth, very far from here, and we mean you no harm." Vorathkin laughed, and the sound was bitter and hollow, and harm is not something I fear anymore, because there is nothing you could do to me that has not already been done. Elena stepped closer, and she ignored the warnings from her crew, and she looked into the dragon's eyes, and she saw 3,000 years of loneliness and pain. And she made a decision in that moment that would change everything. "Tell me your story," she said, "and I will listen." And so Vorathkin told her, and she spoke for hours about her birth and her people, and the curse of her sterility, and the ritual that bound her to this dead ship. And she told Elena about the centuries of isolation and the prayers that went unanswered and the slow decay of hope. Elena listened to every word, and she did not interrupt, and she did not judge. And when the dragon finished speaking, Elena was silent for a long moment. "That is deeply unfair," she finally said, and Vorathkin was confused because she had expected many reactions, but simple acknowledgement of injustice was not one of them. Turned to her crew, and she spoke quickly, and they argued among themselves, and Vorathkin watched with growing confusion as these tiny fragile creatures debated something that seemed to matter greatly to them. Finally, Elena turned back to the dragon, and she said, "We have analyzed the energy patterns of your binding, and we believe we understand how it works, and we think we can break it." Vorathkin stared at her, and she did not dare to believe. "And why would you do this?" she asked. "Because no one does anything without wanting something in return." Elena smiled, and her smile was warm and genuine. And she said, "Because it is the right thing to do, and that is reason enough." The dragon did not understand, and she searched for the trick and the deception and the hidden agenda, but she found nothing. And these humans seemed to genuinely want to help her, simply because helping was good. "We will need to repair this ship," Elena explained, "and the binding is tied to its systems, and if we can restore power and achieve a specific resonance frequency, we can shatter the chains that hold you here." "How long will this take?" Vorathkin asked, and she was afraid to hope, but hope was rising in her chest, despite her best efforts to suppress it. Elena looked around at the ancient vessel, and she calculated the damage and the missing components and the work that would be required, and she said, "Perhaps 2 years if we are lucky." The dragon was silent for a long moment, and 2 years was nothing compared to 3,000. And yet it felt like an eternity, because now she had something to wait for. "I do not understand you," she finally said, "and your people must be very strange if you help strangers for no reward." Elena laughed, and she said, "Yes, we are very strange, and we have a long history of cruelty, but we also have a long history of compassion, and we choose which history to continue." The crew of the Prometheus set up camp in the valley below, and they began the long work of restoration, and Vorathkin watched them from her prison, and she felt something she had not felt in 3,000 years. She felt hope. The first months of work were slow and difficult, and the humans faced challenges that would have defeated lesser beings, and the alien technology was complex and strange, and nothing in their training had prepared them for this task. Elena coordinated the efforts with patience and determination, and she divided her crew into teams and assigned each team a specific section of the ship to analyze and repair, and she herself spent most of her time with Vorathkin, learning about the vessel from the Dragon's 3,000 years of exploration. The chief engineer was a young man named Marcus Chun, and he had graduated at the top of his class, and he had never encountered a problem he could not solve, and the alien ship became his obsession. In the best possible way, Marcus would spend 18 hours at a time crawling through conduits and tracing power lines and mapping systems that had been designed by beings with 6 limbs and compound eyes, and sometimes he would emerge covered in dust and grime with a triumphant grin on his face because he had figured out how something worked. The power core was the most critical component, and it had been dormant for millennia, and Marcus believed he could restart it if he could find the right combination of energy frequencies, and he experimented endlessly and failed repeatedly, but he never gave up. Vorathkin watched these humans work, and she was amazed by their persistence and their creativity and their absolute refusal to accept defeat, and she began to understand that humans were not fragile at all, but were instead incredibly strong in ways that did not involve scales or fire or wings. She helped where she could, and her knowledge of the ship's layout proved invaluable. And she guided the humans through corridors they would never have found on their own, and she warned them away from sections that had become unstable over the centuries. The crew began to visit her not just for work, but for conversation, and they asked her about dragon culture and dragon history, and she found herself telling them stories she had not thought about in thousands of years. They celebrated her people's holidays alongside their own, and Elena researched the dragon calendar and organized a small ceremony for the Festival of First Flight, which was a celebration of young dragons taking to the sky for the first time, and Vorathkin wept during the ceremony because no one had remembered this holiday since her exile. Marcus brought her gifts, and they were small things like interesting rocks and unusual plants, and he explained that humans gave gifts to show affection and appreciation, and Vorathkin treasured each one because they were the first gifts she had received. Since she was a child, the communications officer was a woman named Sarah Park, and she spent hours recording Vorathkin's stories and songs, and she said she wanted to preserve the dragon's culture so it would never be forgotten, and Vorathkin taught her the old songs, and Sarah learned to sing them in her high human voice, and somehow that made them more beautiful. 6 months into the restoration, the crew threw a party to celebrate progress, and they had repaired 30% of the ship's systems, and the power core was showing signs of life, and everyone was optimistic about the future of Arth. Ken could not join them outside the ship because the binding held her fast, but they brought the party to her, and they filled the reactor chamber with lights and music and laughter, and for one night, the ancient tomb felt almost alive. Elena sat beside the dragon, and she shared a bottle of something she called wine, and she said, "I want you to know that you are not broken, and you were never broken, and your people were wrong to treat you the way they did." Vorathkin did not know how to respond because she had believed herself broken for so long that the idea of being whole seemed impossible, and yet Elena spoke with such conviction that the dragon found herself wanting to believe. 1 year into the restoration, there was an accident. Marcus was working in the reactor chamber attempting to stabilize a power fluctuation, and something went wrong, and the reactor surged and released a burst of radiation that would have killed him instantly. Vorathkin did not think, and she did not hesitate, and she threw her body over the young human, and she shielded him from the blast, and the radiation burned her scales and seared her flesh. And she screamed in pain, but she did not move until the surge had passed. The crew rushed to help, and they found Marcus unconscious but alive beneath the dragon's protective form, and Vorathkin collapsed beside him, her body smoking and ruined, and for a terrible moment, Elena thought they had lost them both, but dragons are resilient, and Vorathkin survived, and Marcus survived, and when he woke up and learned what she had done for him, he wept. "You saved my life," he said. "And why would you do Thade Varathkin?" Was too weak to speak, but she managed a small smile, and Elena answered for her, because that is what family does. The word struck Varathkin like lightning, and she had not considered these humans as family, but she realized that Elena was right, and somewhere in the past year these strange small creatures had become more important to her than her own blood relatives had ever been. Remaining months of work were difficult because Varathkin's injuries healed slowly and the binding seemed to punish her for the act of selfless protection, and yet the crew worked harder than ever, driven by gratitude and determination. They called in favors from distant colonies and requisitioned parts that should have been impossible to obtain, and they spent their own savings on equipment that the mission budget could not cover, and they did all of this without complaint because they believed in what they were doing. Elena worked closely with the ship's computer systems, and she discovered something remarkable, and the original crew had left behind detailed logs of their mission and their crash and their final days, and she translated these logs and shared them. With Varathkinth, aliens had been peaceful explorers, and they had traveled across galaxies searching for intelligent life, and they had found this planet and they had hoped to make contact, but their ship had failed and they had died alone, and their last transmission was a message of hope sent into the void we came in. "Peace," the message said, "and we found a beautiful world, and we are sorry we could not stay, but perhaps someday others will come and they will succeed where we failed." Varathkin wept when she heard these words, because she understood that she was not the only one who had been left alone in this place, and the aliens had dreamed of connection and companionship. Just as she had dreamed of it 2 years after the humans arrived, the ship was ready, and all systems had been restored, and the power core hummed with energy, and Marcus had calculated the exact resonance frequency needed to shatter the binding tomorrow. Elena said, and she held the dragon's massive claw in her small human hand, "And tomorrow you will be free." Varathkin looked at this woman who had become her closest friend, and she said, "I am already more free than I have ever been, because you have given me something I never thought I would have again." "What is that?" Elena asked. "Hope," the dragon replied, "and family." The morning of the unbinding dawned cold and clear, and the crew of the Prometheus gathered in the reactor chamber, and they were nervous and excited and afraid because they did not know if their plan would work. Varathkin lay in the center of the chamber, and she could feel the ancient chains wrapped around her soul, and they had been part of her for so long that she could barely remember what it felt like to be without them. Lena had spent the night reviewing the calculations and checking the systems, and she was confident that the resonance frequency was correct, but she also knew that there were many things they did not understand about dragon magic and alien technology. Marcus stood at the main control panel, and his hands trembled slightly as he prepared to initiate the sequence, and he looked at Varathkin, and she nodded, and he took a deep breath and pressed the activation button. The ship came alive with light and sound, and the power core began to pulse with energy, and the resonance built slowly at first, and then faster, and Varathkin felt the vibrations in her bones and in her soul. The binding resisted, and it fought back against the new energy, and it tightened around her like a living thing trying to crush her before it could be destroyed, and she screamed as pain, unlike anything she had ever experienced, tore through her body. "Keep going," Elena shouted over the noise, "and we are almost there." But something was wrong, and Varathkin could feel it, and the binding was too strong, and her body was too weak, and the chains were not breaking. They were killing her. Dragon had been sustained by the binding for 3,000 years, and without it, her body did not know how to survive, and she was dying. Not from the chains, but from the freedom. Elena saw what was happening, and she understood the problem immediately, and the dragon needed an external source of life energy to bridge the gap between imprisonment and freedom. And there was only one way to provide it. She ran to the neural interface station, and she connected the leads. to her own temples, and she said, "Nobody stop me because I know what I am doing, Captain." Marcus called out, "And this is insane, and you could die." Elena looked at him, and she said, "So could she, and that is not acceptable." She activated the interface, and she felt her consciousness expand into the ship's systems, and she found Vorathkin's life force flickering like a candle in the storm, and she reached out with her own energy, and she poured her strength into the dragon. Sensation was overwhelming, and Elena felt herself being pulled apart and stretched across dimensions she could not comprehend, and she held on with everything she had, because Vorathkin was worth saving. The dragon felt the human's energy flooding into her, and it was warm and bright and full of love and compassion and determination, and she had never felt anything like it. And she understood that Elena was sacrificing herself too. Save someone she had known for only 2 years. "You cannot do this," Vorathkin said through the neural link, "and you will die." Elena's response came as pure emotion rather than words, and it was a feeling of absolute certainty and unwavering commitment. And it said, "I will not let you go." The crew watched helplessly as their captain convulsed in the interface chair, and they wanted to pull her out, but they knew that breaking the connection now would kill them both, and all they could do was watch and wait in hope. Vorathkin made a decision, and she had spent 3,000 years being passive and accepting her fate and letting others determine her destiny, and she would not let Elena die for her. She reached through the neural link, and she found the captain's consciousness, and she wrapped herself around it protectively, and she said, "If we die together, but we will not die today." The dragon drew on reserves of strength she did not know she possessed, and she pulled energy from the ship itself, and from the planet beneath them, and from the stars above, and she channeled all of it into the moment of breaking. The binding shattered. The chains that had held Vorathkin for 3,000 years exploded into fragments of light, and they scattered across the chamber like falling stars, and the dragon roared with a voice that had been silent for millennia. Elena collapsed in the interface chair, and her body went limp, and the neural leads sparked and died, and for one terrible moment no one mothered. Vorathkin crawled toward her, and she was weak, and her body was trembling, but she reached the human, and she pressed her massive head against Elena's chest, and she listened for a heartbeat. Seconds passed, and they felt like hours, and the crew held their breath and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Then Elena coughed, and her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at the dragon looming over her, and she smiled. "Did it work?" she asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. Vartny laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy that echoed through the chamber, and she said, "Yes, you impossible, stubborn, wonderful creature, it worked." The crew erupted in cheers, and they rushed forward, and they embraced each other, and they embraced the dragon, and for a moment, everyone was crying and laughing at the same time. Marcus helped Elena sit up, and he said, "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do." Elena shook her head, and she said, "I just did what any of us would have done, and we are family. And family does not leave each other." Behen Vorathki looked at these humans, and she felt something shift inside her, and the weight of 3,000 years of loneliness and pain and despair lifted from her shoulders, and she was free, not just free from the binding, but free from the belief that she was worthless and broken and undeserving of love. And these small, fragile creatures had given her something that her own powerful species had never given her. They had given her hope, and they had given her family, and they had shown her that strength was not measured in scales or fire, or the ability to produce offspring. Strength was measured in compassion and courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. "We need to get outside," Vorathkin said. "I need to see the sky, and I need to feel the sun, and I need to fly." The crew helped her to her feet, and they guided her through the corridors of the ship that had been her prison for 3,000 years, and they emerged into the cold mountain air, and the sun was rising over the peaks. Vorathkin spread her wings, and they were weak and stiff from millennia of disuse, but they still worked, and she looked up at the endless blue sky, and she wept. Then she launched herself into the air, and she flew for the first time in 3,000 years, and the wind caught her wings and lifted her higher and higher, and she roared with joy that echoed across the mountains. Below her the humans watched, and they cheered, and they cried, and they held each other close, and they knew that they had done something wonderful. Elena leaned against Marcus for support because she was still weak from the neural interface, and she watched the dragon soar through the sky, and she smiled. "She's free," Elena said, "and we did it, and she's finally free." The dragon landed in a field of flowers that grew in the valley below the mountains, and the blooms were purple and gold, and they swayed in the breeze. And Vorathkin lay among them, and she breathed in their sweet scent. She had forgotten what flowers smelled like, and she had forgotten what grass felt like beneath her scales, and she had forgotten the simple joy of lying in sunlight with nothing to bind her, and nowhere she had to be. Elena made her way down from the mountains, and it took her most of the day because she was still recovering from the neural interface, and her body was weak and exhausted, but she would not rest until she had seen Vorathkin again. She found the dragon in the flower field, and Vorathkin raised her head as the human approached, and her eyes were clear and bright for the first time in millennia. "You came," Elena said, "and you actually came back." Vorathkin smiled, and she said, "I will always come back because you are my family, and family stays together." Elena sat beside the dragon, and she pulled out a small medical device, and she began scanning Vorathkin's vital signs, and the readings were remarkable, and the dragon's body was healing rapidly, and her strength was returning faster than anyone had expected. "The binding suppressed you," Elena said, "and it kept you weak and barely alive, and without it, you are becoming yourself again." Vorathkin nodded, and she said, "I can feel it, and I feel stronger than I have ever felt, and I feel whole." The crew came down from the mountains over the following days, and they set up camp in the flower field, and they celebrated their success with food and music and stories and laughter. Vorathkin learned the names of human foods, and she discovered that she loved something called chocolate, and Marcus brought her bars of it from the ship's supplies, and she declared it the greatest invention in the history of the universe. Sarah recorded more of the dragon songs, and she played them back on the ship speakers, and Vorathkin heard her own voice singing the old melodies, and she realized that her culture would survive, even if she was the last of her kind to remember it. Elena asked her what she wanted to do now that she was free, and was a question that Vorathkin had not considered, because she had spent so long focused on survival that she had forgotten to think about living. "I could stay here," she said, "and this world is beautiful, and I could make it my home." But Elena could see something in the dragon's eyes, and it was curiosity and longing and a desire for something more. Or she said, "You could come with us." Vorathkin looked at her, and she said, "Is that possible? And would your people accept me?" Elena laughed, and she said, "Humans have a long history of adopting strays and unusual companions, and I think they would love you." The dragon considered this, and she thought about everything she had learned about humanity and their capacity for kindness and their willingness to help strangers and their belief that every being deserved a chance at happiness. She also thought about her own people and how they had cast her out for something she could not control, and how they had imprisoned her for 3,000 years, and how they had never once tried to help her. "The choice was not difficult. I will come with you," she said, "and I want to see the stars, and I want to meet more humans, and I want to learn everything about your people and your culture and your history." Elena smiled, and she said then, "Welcome to the crew, and we are honored to have you." The preparations for departure took several weeks, and the humans had to modify the Prometheus to accommodate a dragon passenger, and they removed walls and expanded corridors and installed larger doors. Vorathkin helped with the work, and she discovered that she was surprisingly good at engineering tasks, and her claws were precise, and her fire could be controlled to weld metal, and Marcus said she was a natural. On the day of departure, the crew gathered on the bridge, and they looked out at the planet that had been Vorathkin's imprisoned for 3,000 years, and the mountains stood cold and silent in the distance. "Do you want to say goodbye?" Elena asked. Varathkin shook her head, and she said, "No, and there is nothing here for me anymore, and my home is with you now." Elena gave the order, and the Prometheus lifted off from the planet's surface and climbed through the atmosphere and broke free of gravity and soared into the endless darkness of space. Varathkin watched through the viewports, and she saw the stars spread out before her, and they were countless and beautiful, and each one represented a world she had never seen and a story she had never heard. "Where do we go now?" she asked. Elena pulled up a star chart, and she pointed to a bright spot near the center, and she said, "That is Earth, and that is where we come from, and I think you should see it." The journey took 3 months, and Varathkin spent the time learning about human history and human culture and human achievements and human failures, and she was fascinated by everything. She learned about the wars they had fought among themselves and the cruelty they had inflicted on their own kind, and she also learned about the movements for justice and equality and compassion that had transformed their society. She learned that humans had once treated those who were different the same way her people had treated her, and they had cast out the sick and the disabled and the unusual, and they had declared them worthless. But they had also fought to change, and they had built movements and written laws and changed hearts and minds, and they had learned to see value in every person, regardless of ability or appearance or circumstance. This gave Varathkin hope, and it showed her that even the cruelest species could choose a different path, and that nothing was truly permanent, except the capacity for growth. When the Prometheus entered Earth's solar system, Varathkin pressed her face against the viewport, and she stared at the blue planet that grew larger with each passing hour. "It is beautiful," she said. Elena stood beside her, and she said, "Yes, it is, and it is home, and now it is your home too." The landing was complicated because Earth's governments had to be notified and protocols had to be followed, and there were many meetings and discussions about how to handle an alien dragon arriving on the planet. But in the end, the humans welcomed Varathkin, and they were curious and excited and a little afraid, but mostly they were kind. She became famous almost overnight, and reporters wanted to interview her, and scientists wanted to study her, and children wanted to meet her, and she found herself surrounded by attention and affection in ways she had never imagined. Years passed, and Varathkin became an ambassador of sorts, and she traveled to human colonies across the galaxy, and she shared her story, and she taught people about compassion and acceptance and the importance of never giving up hope. She also became a protector, and when threats arose, she defended her, adopted people with fire and fury, and she made it clear that anyone who tried to harm humanity would face the wrath of an ancient dragon. Other species learned to respect humans, and part of that respect came from knowing that they had earned the loyalty of one of the galaxy's oldest beings, and when they asked how this had happened, the answer was always the same. The humans had found something broken, and they had not turned away, and they had not exploited it, and they had not feared it. They had healed it. Varathkin often thought about her own people and the elders who had condemned her, and she wondered what had happened to them and whether they knew what she had become. She did not seek revenge, and she did not seek validation, and she had moved beyond the need for their approval because she had found something better. She had found family. One evening she sat on the rooftop of a building in a city called New York, and Elena sat beside her, and they watched the sun set over the towers and the streets below. "I was told I could never have children," Varathkin said, "and my people said I would leave no legacy and no mark upon the universe." Elena looked at her and waited. "They were wrong," the dragon continued, and she gestured to the city, spread out before them, and the humans walking on the streets below, and the ships flying overhead, and the countless lives that had been touched by her story. "This is my legacy," she said, "and these people are my children, and my mark upon the universe is not measured in offspring, but in love." Elena smiled, and she said, I think that is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Varathkin looked up at the stars, and she thought about the long journey that had brought her here, and the 3,000 years of pain and loneliness, and the humans who had saved her, and the new life she had built. She had prayed for so long, and she had not known what she was praying for, and she had thought she wanted death or freedom or revenge. But what she had really wanted was connection, and she had found it in the most unexpected place with the most unexpected beings. The ancient dragon had gotten her prayers answered, and the answer had not been what she expected. The answer had been humanity, and that was the most wonderful answer of all. Claude is at I and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.